Lifetimes of loneliness. During my stay at your 5-day training course, I had several regressions. In 2 of them, I died in a very lonely state. In the first life, I was a teacher who taught in a hillside primary school in a primitive and poor village. I was a taught in a hillside primary school in a primitive and poor village. I was a single woman who lived alone. It seemed that I was not intimate with my students. I died accidentally on the hill, where wild dogs bit at my stomach. Nobody was aware of my death. In the second regression, I was a reporter, and again a single woman. I worked hard and quite aggressively, but I again died lonely, this time in a train crash. When others who were either dead or injured were picked up by their families, I was still lying on the side. Nobody came to pick me up, nobody claimed my corpse. In both of the cases, I was cool and reserved as a person, that's why I was rather lonely during the lives, and in the moments of death as well. But in this life, I chose to be a social worker. I go to people and offer help. I adopted 2 girls, not just to develop my own family but also to help, in a very intensive way, these 2 little girls. I have learned to give and relate to others, even if sometimes I have struggled to do so. And I am so happy with all of these people nearby. I know that in this life, I will never die alone again, with nobody around me. Tongtong's regressions demonstrate that patterns often reveal themselves in these experiences to illuminate our spiritual paths. She needed to express and to receive love, and she is doing exactly that. Tong is learning her lessons and finding out more about unconditional love. We are never alone, even if we forget this. And her choice of a social work career preceded the regression. She had intuitively chosen the path of love and service. These were not Tong's only experiences. She shares more below. Homeward bound. My mother and father separated when I was 6 years old and divorced a few years later. They often had fights in the middle of the night. One day, I woke up in the morning and found that my mom had left, and her bed became vacant from then on. She had her new family soon after, and then so did my dad. I had grown up in a childhood with lots of loneliness and anxiety, lots of neglect. I have 3 sisters, but we were often left at home without an adult to look after us. As the second sister, I had to take care of the small ones by providing them with food or cooking them meals later, when I could manage the task, and by doing the household chores when my elder sister was not at home. When I was in primary school, my mom would forget to take me home. When I was in primary school, my mom would forget to take me home. I would stand at the school gate for hours, waiting for her with loads of loneliness, helplessness, and uncertainty. At 25, I got married, which I had longed to do. My husband is a colleague of mine in the same office, so we can see each other during business hours. He is a family-oriented man who gave me a sense of security after we married. However, I still found myself lonely whenever he was not with me, as when he worked late, went out for an evening class, or had drinks with his buddies. And I worried that he was not mature enough to manage his tasks or any challenges in life. This fear haunted me in a subtle way for a long time. I also began, rather desperately, to long for babies of my own. I thought that then I would be wanted by somebody, and that I would always be with the kids if I could just have them. However, I tried for more than 6 years. I couldn't have one. It made me even more desperate. In one regression I did with Dr. Brian Weiss's CD, I went back to an ancient time. In a bare, remote countryside, I was on my way home after a long war. I was a warrior with a huge body, like Hagrid in the Harry Potter books. I was dirty, hairy, tough, and strong, and I carried a large hammer as a tool for fighting. Walking with strength and speed, as if I were banging the land with each footstep, I was on my way home to see my wife and young son. It seemed that I had been walking for a long time, tired but still strong in every step. I was alone the entire way, there were only stones and some bushes in the surrounding fields. I walked and walked with nothing and nobody around. When I saw my home, I became extremely excited and walked even faster. I opened the door to find my wife in a wooden hut, sitting next to a baby's crib. In the crib was my young son. I recognized him as my husband in this life. I got a flash. I was so worried about him not being strong enough to stay by himself and protect his mother when I was at war and could not be with them. I woke up in the regression and realized that it was my own problem, not my husband's, if I constantly worried about him not being strong or mature enough. From then on, I stopped feeling anxious about him. I still nag him from time to time, but not in the same manner as before. In another regression I did during the 5-day hypnotherapy training class at Omega in New York, I didn't go back to a previous life but instead to the very first time in this life that I felt lonely. I was 6 years old and in China. It was a school day, and the weather was turning cold as autumn stepped out and winter stepped in. School had ended, and I stood at the gate, waiting for my winter stepped in. School had ended, and I stood at the gate, waiting for my mom to take me home. I waited and waited, but she didn't turn up. Seeing the students leaving the classroom and being picked up by their parents at the school bus, I became anxious. When all the students had gone and the buses had set off, I was left alone as darkness came with the evening. I stood on the street in front of the gate, which had already been closed. I was so hopeless. This was the first time in my life that I knew how loneliness felt. In the hypnosis, I thought, why don't I try to walk back home by myself? It was only 15 minutes or several blocks away from where I was, maybe I could remember the way. I took a deep breath and started the walk back home. I was so excited, I was a bit scared but also a bit happy to leave the darkness in the corner of the school gate. As I took my first big step and set off for home, the scene changed, and in the trance I saw myself running through a long movie or film tape. The contents of the film were all of those situations in which I had experienced loneliness in life, and there had been many over my 30 years. I was growing older and older, from a 6-year-old girl to now, as I ran through all those times. I was so happy and lofty. I ran as if I were flying, my shirt flapping in the wind. I came back to where I was, to the room at the Omega training course, and understood that I was not the helpless little girl of 6 years old. I learned that I could do something by myself and for myself, that I have the confidence to make myself free from the darkness. For more than 30 years, I have been working and learning so hard to overcome all the challenges in my life, rather than waiting and relying on others or feeling helpless. After that regression, I have never had that kind of lonely feeling again. And after a few years, I adopted 2 baby girls as my daughters. I realized that I could do something to make myself happy, instead of waiting hopelessly for pregnancy. All 4 of us in the family, and the grannies too, are so happy and pleased with the current situation. I think it might be the best time in my life. It certainly is the sweetest. The regressions allowed Tong to gain a sense of control in her life. She was able to recognize the past life origins of her doubts about her husband's maturity, which permitted her to let go of her fears and anxieties. Not all symptom-inducing traumas are found in prior lifetimes. Tong's feeling of helplessness was rooted in her present life childhood. As she watched her subconscious display a series of scenes of her loneliness, she became empowered to take control and to be courageous. Adopting the baby girls represented, to some degree, her conscious decision to not be so fearful and passive, but instead to be active, hopeful, and happy. Tong, from China, also demonstrates the universality of past life memories and their powerful healing potential. The experience of prior lifetimes and of the after-death state is remarkably consistent, no matter which culture or religion is involved. People from wildly divergent nationalities and spiritual traditions are able to remember past lives that took place all over the planet. They learn the same life lessons. They are able to heal physically and emotionally, to repair their relationships, as Tong did, and to attain more peace and happiness in their lives. Early life enculturation and conditioning do not influence the content of the past life recall or spiritual experience. We are all students in this great earth school. Does it really make a difference where our classroom is located? Evelyn was an African American woman in her 40s. She had a severe phobia of water and of drowning. Although she didn't have any real clue to where this fear came from, it certainly interfered with her life. Her husband had recently bought a boat, which only intensified her fear. It had been his dream to own one, and he did not understand the depth of Evelyn's phobia. Her husband, who was outside my office during the session, was surprised to learn later that Evelyn did not even own a bathing suit. She felt that this would bring her one dreaded step closer to the water. She was also afraid that her fear of drowning was spilling over onto her 3 children, and that it would interfere with their pleasure in the water and in the new boat. Evelyn's anxiety was so severe that she had traveled half the country to see me. Whenever she put her feet in water, she told me, it felt as if hands were pulling her into it. She was very, very afraid of being around water, but even more afraid of not being able to catch her breath. These fears seemed connected, but not necessarily so. I tucked this away in the back of my mind. As I regressed her, Evelyn first went back to childhood memories. She recalled being an infant and hearing a loud noise, which had caused her to cry. As she continued crying, she couldn't breathe, and she was overcome with anxiety and panic. She saw her aunt and uncle with her, and they were terrified. Evelyn, as a baby, felt confused. She knew that her aunt and uncle were alarmed. She could feel their tension, but she didn't understand, at that young age, what was happening. Evelyn then experienced a past life that had taken place several hundred years ago, in which she was an African boy of 12 or 13 years. The boy, along with others from his village, had been captured by slave traders. His mother in that life was a spiritual leader of the people, probably possessing special powers and certainly healing abilities, but even she couldn't stop the tragedy of these young children being taken from the village. In that same lifetime, Evelyn recalled the boy being held down by two white men, a boot on his throat. The men spoke a strange language. He was then baptized or cleaned in a long tub with a mirror nearby. The tub was filled with water, into which the boy was being forced down. As the water came near his face, he gagged, choked, and found himself unable to breathe. It was truly terrifying. This baptism occurred before leaving Africa, which may help to specify which cultures were engaging in that practice, as there were others who did not enforce baptisms until these slaves arrived in the new country. Her next memory was a vivid one of the same boy, around the age of 20 now. He did not know the rules of these strange white people, and he had merely said something not very significant, to a white woman. Rather suddenly, he was grabbed, his arms were tied behind his back, and he was placed on a chopping block and decapitated. Evelyn could see the image of his mother's face nearby. The mother had died, apparently, sometime before he had. She was talking to him and communicating a feeling of deep peace. This allowed the young man to become calmer. Afterward, he could see his head and torso separated from each other. But his soul, was all right. Evelyn observed clearly the disdain and aloofness on the face of the white men and women who were looking on. They didn't care. So barbaric, Evelyn said. How could people do such things? The boy's consciousness floated up to the clouds. He was feeling free, strong, and peaceful, and he could breathe. His earlier thought, immediately before the beheading, had been, I'll never be able to breathe again. At the end of the session, after floating above the boy's body, seeing the mother's face, and feeling this peace, Evelyn told me she felt like skipping, and that she felt so much freer, lighter, and happier. Before emerging from the session, Evelyn had another memory from her current life, an earlier childhood memory with her older brother. He was forcing her to go down a water slide, and she remembered her mouth filling with water as she had difficulty breathing. This confirmed even more so that her fear was not just of water but of not being able to breathe. After our session ended, Evelyn called her mother, who confirmed that when Evelyn was about 6 months old, she had cried so much that she had turned blue. Her mother had panicked, not knowing what to do, and she had run to the aunt's house with Evelyn in her arms. They were able to calm her down, and her breathing returned to normal as her blue color disappeared. We were both soaked in sweat. The energy, intensity, and visual details and emotions were so profound during this regression session. Just a few days after our session, Evelyn was able to walk in a swimming pool, wearing a bathing suit, the first she had owned in many years, with no anxiety at all. She knew that there was nothing to fear. The fear had come from a long time ago, it was not of the present or the future. Evelyn's phobia was virtually cured in only one session. Simply recalling the traumas in her childhood and past life was enough to allow her to let go of her symptoms. Her fear of water diminished, and her breathing was much improved. As we let go of the past's negativities, and as we regard the future with no worries, we will be released from the constrictions of time. We will live fully in the beauty and freedom of the present moment. In her past life as the young boy sold into slavery, Evelyn experienced firsthand the terrible effects of racial prejudice and inequality. Gabriella, the subject of the next case, also soulmate. This is a part of Zindagi Ki Roshni consultancy. It has been established for those who have lost someone and for those who are very sad in their life. About 100 PDF books and 20 short audio books of this topic will be sent to those who join it. This data will be sent to their email or WhatsApp. If you want to join this organization, then please send WhatsApp message to this number.